The morning Effie Holloway rode into Caldwell, Kansas, with her skirt still pressed and her boots still clean. Every man in the rocking R bunkhouse stopped what he was doing and stared like she was some kind of strange bird that had blown in off the wrong wind entirely. It was the spring of 1881, the kind of April that smelled like mud and promise in equal measure, when the cattle drives were just starting to rev up along the Kishom Trail, and the town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Indian Territory like a man balancing on a fence post, one boot in civilization, and the other dangling over something wilder than most people cared to name. The main street was packed dirt and horse dung, and the distant sound of piano music from the Blue Bell Saloon, and into the middle of all of it rode Effie Holloway on a borrowed roan mare, sitting straight-backed and careful, holding her reins with the kind of deliberate grip that told anyone paying attention that she had absolutely no idea what she was doing, but was determined not to show it. She was 24 years old, and she had come from St. Louis, Missouri, where she had spent her whole life until 3 weeks ago working as a bookkeeper for her father's textile import business. She had neat brown hair and gray eyes that were sharper than most people expected when they looked at a woman dressed the way she was, and she had exactly $47.30 in her leather satchel, along with a letter from a man named Harold Rutledge, who had promised her employment as a ranch records keeper for the Rocking R cattle operation. Harold Rutledge was dead. She found that out within the first 20 minutes of arriving, when she walked into the office of the ranch's operating foreman, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a permanent squint named Dale Pickett, who looked at her letter of employment like it was something that had crawled out from under a rock. "Harold passed on 7 weeks ago," Dale said, not unkindly, but not particularly gently either. Hart gave out. "His nephew owns the spread now." "And the nephew?" Effie asked, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was doing something unsteady inside her chest. "Stephen Garrett. He's out on the south pasture right now checking the herd count before the drive. He'll be back before sundown." Dale looked her over again. "You come all the way from St. Louis for a bookkeeping job." "I did," Effie said. "Long way to come." "It is," she agreed. She sat in the small front office of the Rocking R ranch house and waited. And while she waited, she listened to the sounds of the place settling around her. The creak of the building in the Kansas wind, the distant lowing of cattle, the voices of men in the bunkhouse across the yard talking and laughing, and occasionally making remarks she was quite certain were directed at her presence. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight, and she did not let herself think too hard about the $47.30, or about how far St. Louis was, or about the fact that the man who had hired her was in the ground, and his nephew might very well turn her away before nightfall. Stephen Garrett came in with the last of the afternoon light, and Effie heard him before she saw him, his boots heavy and purposeful on the wooden porch outside, then the door swinging open with the easy confidence of a man who had never been uncertain about whether he belonged somewhere. He was maybe 28 or 29, taller than she expected, with dark hair that wanted to curl at his temples despite obvious attempts to keep it under control, and the kind of face that the Kansas sun had been working on seriously for a good number of years. He had his uncle's jaw, broad and square, but his eyes were different, darker, almost black in the dim light of the office, and they landed on Effie with an expression she could not quite read. "Miss Holloway," he said, because Dale had clearly sent word out to find him. He pulled off his hat and held it. "I'm Stephen Garrett." "I gathered," she said, and stood and offered her hand, which he shook with evident surprise at the firmness of her grip. "I'm real sorry about Uncle Harold. He was a good man, and he clearly thought highly enough of your abilities to offer you work." He sat down across from her and set his hat on his knee. "And I'm sorrier still that you made that journey on the strength of a letter that I couldn't honor if I wanted to, which is that he promised you steady work for a full year." Effie felt something cold move through her, but she kept her expression even. "You're dismissing the offer." "I'm not dismissing it so much as explaining reality," Stephen said, and his voice had a directness she appreciated even while she found it inconvenient. The ranch is not in the kind of shape where I can pay a bookkeeper a city salary for a year. Uncle Harold's record keeping was, to put it politely, a mess. We've got a drive to prepare for, 1,000 head of longhorns going up the Kishom to Abilene, and I've got 9 cowboys who need to be paid and a cook who's threatening to quit, and a line of creditors who are real interested in whether this herd makes it there and sells well. Then you need your books managed more than ever, Effie said. Stephen looked at her. Your records are a mess, you said so yourself. How do you know which creditors take priority? How do you know what you owe versus what you're owed? How will you manage the payroll for your men at the end of the drive without knowing what your margins are? She kept her voice measured and factual. I ran my father's books for 4 years. I can have your records organized within a week. Miss Holloway, I appreciate the offer, but a cattle drive is not. I'm not asking to go on the cattle drive, she said. I'm asking to stay here and put your accounts in order so that when the drive is done and you come back with whatever you get for that herd, you actually know what you're doing with the money. There was a silence in the office. Outside, a man laughed at something in the bunkhouse and then was shushed, which meant they were listening through the walls, Effie suspected. Stephen turned his hat in his hands twice. I can offer you room and board while you work and a percentage of what the ranch clears on the drive, paid when the herd sells. Nothing guaranteed until then. That's a considerable risk for me, Effie said. It is, he agreed, but it's an honest offer. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't quite categorize, not condescension, not pity, just a straightforward kind of appraisal that she found she didn't mind as much as she expected to. I'll take it, she said. That night, Effie was given a small room at the back of the ranch house that had been used for storage, and she lay on a narrow cot listening to the prairie wind and thinking that she had absolutely lost her mind. Back in St. Louis, her mother was probably still sending daily letters to the address she no longer lived at, and her older brother James was probably shaking his head the same way he had been shaking it when she announced she was leaving, and her old life was sitting there like a coat she had left on a hook, patient and familiar, waiting for her to come back to it. She did not go back to it. The next morning she found the ranch's ledgers, which were 4 oversized books crammed with Harold Rutledge's handwriting and supplemented by what appeared to be napkins, loose scraps of paper, and the backs of envelopes, all shoved between the pages in a manner that suggested Harold had kept the full picture of his accounts mostly in his head and relied on the written record only as a rough guide. Effie spread everything out on the big table in the front room and began. She was still at it when the bunkhouse emptied for breakfast, and she heard the sounds of men crossing the yard. Through the window she could see them glancing toward the ranch house, and she heard pieces of their conversations when the wind was right. Harold's nephew think that city woman's going to fix his books. She'll be gone in a week, 2 days. She doesn't know a longhorn from a milk cow. Effie turned back to the ledgers. The man who spoke most was named Cutter Briggs. She would learn his name later. A wiry, sun-dried cowboy in his mid-30s with the disposition of someone who had never been wrong about anything in his life and was not planning to start. He was the Rocking R's most experienced trail hand, and he wore that fact like a second hat, visible from a distance, always slightly in the way. He had been on 7 drives up the Kishom Trail, and he had no particular patience for change of any kind, and the arrival of Effie Holloway represented to him a special category of change that he found particularly objectionable. She heard him the 3rd morning talking in the yard with 2 other hands, a young man named Pete Dawes who was maybe 19 and eager to please, and a quiet, stocky Mexican cowboy named Rodrigo Vila who was one of the better ropers on the outfit. She's too city for this place, Cutter was saying. You watch. First real rainstorm and she'll fold up like paper. She's been working those books every day since she got here, Pete offered, in the uncertain way of someone who wasn't sure whether they were defending something or just observing it. Books, Cutter said like the word tasted bad. That's not ranching. Any clerk can read numbers. Rodrigo said nothing, which was his way. Effie stepped out onto the porch with her coffee cup and said, pleasantly, "Good morning." And all three of them went quiet and then said good morning back with varying degrees of embarrassment, and then dispersed to their morning work. Stephen came to check on her progress that evening after supper, which the ranch cook, a barrel-shaped man of 50 named Horace who made good biscuits and serviceable everything else, sent to the ranch house on a tray since Effie had declined to eat at the bunkhouse table. Stephen sat across from her in the lamplight and looked at the organized rows of figures she had produced from Harold's chaos and was quiet for a long moment. "This is the full picture?" he asked. "As complete as I could make it with what was here. There are 3 debts I couldn't fully reconcile because the original agreements aren't in your uncle's papers. I'll need you to describe those transactions to me so I can document them properly." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. "You see here, this line, this is what you've been losing to spoilage in your feed stores for the past 8 months. If you change your storage arrangement before next winter, you'll save roughly $60 a year." Stephen stared at the page. $60? That's a conservative estimate, could be as high as 80. He looked up at her. In the lamplight, his face was difficult to read, but she thought she saw something like genuine surprise there, and something else she didn't examine too closely. "You did all this in 3 days. Numbers were all there," she said. "They just needed organizing. Uncle Harold thought he understood his finances." "Your uncle was a good cattleman," Effie said carefully. "The ranching decisions I see recorded here are solid. He understood cattle. The record keeping was a secondary concern for him. That's not unusual." Stephen was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Miss Holloway, I owe you an apology." "For what exactly?" "For thinking you'd be gone in a week." She looked at him. "Were you the one who thought that, or was it the bunkhouse?" Something crossed his face, a quick movement that she thought might have been the beginning of a smile that he was controlling. "Both," he said honestly. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and dark and full of wind, and inside the lamp made a warm circle and Stephen Garrett's hands were spread on the table on either side of the ledger book, and Effie thought, with a small clear part of her mind that was always noticing things, that they were good hands, careful and strong and marked by real work. "The drive," she said, turning her attention back to the practical. "I have concerns about the timing. Your current feed costs are higher than they should be by this point in the season. If the drive is delayed past mid-May, you're looking at additional expense that will affect your margins meaningfully." "We're aiming for the 15th, Stephen said. "Good, I'll have full accounts completed before you leave." He stood and took his hat from the table and turned it in his hands in the way she was already beginning to recognize as a habit of his. "You planning to stay while we're gone? That's a long time drive to Abilene and back." "I'll have more than enough to keep me occupied," Effie said. "Your quarterly supplier invoices alone will take 2 weeks." He nodded. "All right." He started for the door and then paused with his hand on the frame and turned back. "For what it's worth, Cutter Briggs is the best trail hand I have, but he's not always right about everything. Whatever he may have said about you." "I didn't hear anything," Effie said. "No," Stephen said, and this time the smile made it all the way through, brief and warm and real. "I don't imagine you did." He left, and Effie sat for a moment with the ledger in front of her and the lamplight making shadows on the walls, and told herself firmly that there was nothing to think about and went back to work. The drive preparations consumed the next 2 weeks with a kind of organized frenzy that Effie observed and participated in more than anyone expected. She had the good sense to stay out of the purely physical work, the cutting and branding, and the endless sorting of 1,000 restless longhorns who had opinions about being sorted, but she was useful in ways that surprised people. She sat with Stephen and Dale Pickett every evening going over route logistics, distance and water sources, and the carrying costs of the chuck wagon supplies, and she cross-referenced those conversations against the ledger records to give them real numbers to work with instead of estimates. Horace the cook, it turned out, had been consistently overestimating his supply needs by about 20%, not out of dishonesty, but out of the cook's natural anxiety about running short. And Effie was able to show him, gently and with actual figures, that the overstock was costing the drive money that was better spent elsewhere. Horace grumbled about it for a day and a half and then admitted she was right and recalculated his supply list. And after that, he started leaving an extra biscuit on her breakfast tray without comment, which was Horace's version of profound affection. Cutter Briggs did not warm to her. He was not rude, exactly, but there was a quality to his not-rudeness that was wearing in its own way, a constant low-level skepticism that Effie felt like a draft from a poorly sealed window. He made it clear to anyone who would listen that the drive would be fine without accounting, and that women had no place in the practical business of getting cattle to market. And when Effie pointed out during one evening meeting that the proposed water stop at Bluff Creek was going to be 23 miles from the previous stop, and that was a long stretch for cattle in late April heat, Cutter's expression suggested she had said something adorably irrelevant. "We've made that stretch before," he said. "Your records show you lost 11 head on that stretch 2 drives ago," Effie said, not looking up from the ledger. "In April." Cutter looked at Stephen. Stephen looked at the ledger. 15 miles between the first 2 water stops and 23 between the second and third, Effie said. "If you reverse the order and camp at Willow Spring first, which is 10 miles shorter on the first day and splits the longer distance differently, the cattle arrive at each stop in better condition and you reduce your risk of loss." She turned the book and pushed it across to Stephen. "This is not accounting, Mr. Briggs. This is just reading what already happened and applying it." The silence in the room was different from the usual silences. Pete Dawes looked at the floor. Rodrigo Vila looked at his hands. Dale Pickett looked out the window with the expression of a man who had lived long enough to know when to stay neutral. Cutter said, "Stephen, you're going to let a bookkeeper tell you how to run a drive." "I'm going to listen to information that my own records confirm," Stephen said, and his voice was even but had an edge under it. "We'll adjust the route." Cutter pushed his chair back and left without another word, and the door of the ranch house banged behind him, and outside they heard his boots loud and deliberate all the way back to the bunkhouse. Later that evening Stephen found Effie on the porch, where she had gone to get a breath of air after the stuffiness of the meeting room. The sky over Kansas was doing its extravagant thing, going orange and deep red along the horizon and deepening to a blue overhead that was so thick and dark it seemed close enough to reach. "He'll come around," Stephen said, leaning on the porch railing beside her. "He doesn't have to come around," Effie said. "He just needs to not override the route change in the field." "He won't. He disagrees with things until they're decided and then he executes them well. He's stubborn, not destructive." Effie considered this. "Your uncle hired him 12 years ago." Cutter was 19 and half-starved and showed up asking for work, and Uncle Harold said he had the look of someone who needed a place more than he needed a salary. Stephen was quiet for a moment. Harold was right about people. He was a good judge. "He was a good judge to hire you," Effie said, and then felt the quality of the silence shift and added carefully, "to run the ranch." Stephen turned his head and looked at her in the evening light. He had been getting sunburned across the nose again, she noticed, the way he did every spring when the glare off the flat Kansas land was at its worst. "He didn't hire me. He left it to me when he went. I'm not sure I'd have chosen this if I'd been given a choice." "What would you have chosen?" He looked back at the horizon. "I don't know, law maybe. I liked reading when I was young. Uncle Harold had books, which wasn't common out here." A pause. "What would you have chosen if you'd been given a full choice?" Effie thought about it. The question was asked honestly and she wanted to answer it honestly. "This," she said, and then, because that might have sounded simple, added, "not St. Louis anyway. Not the ledgers for my father's business, which were very straightforward and never surprised me. Something that mattered. Something where what I did made a difference to whether things succeeded or failed." Stephen was quiet for a moment, Then he said, "You know, Cutter said you were too city for this." "I know," Effie said. "I've heard variations of that sentiment several times." "What do you think about it?" She looked at the darkening sky. "I think being from a city doesn't mean anything about what a person is capable of. It just means that's where they started." She paused. "Though I'll grant you I did have to ask Horace what a dewlap was during the branding last week, which I suspect didn't help my case." Stephen laughed. It was a good laugh, genuine and unpracticed, and it transformed his face in a way that she found herself wanting to look at for longer than was strictly sensible. "A dewlap is the loose skin under the jaw of the cattle," Effie said. "I know now. I looked it up." "Of course you did," Stephen said, still smiling, and the way he said it was warm and private, like it was a thing between them specifically. And Effie looked back at the horizon and thought about numbers for a minute until the feeling settled. The morning before the drive was set to leave, which was the 14th of May, 1881, a morning of extraordinary blue sky and wind out of the south smelling like green grass and distance, something happened that changed everything. Effie was at her usual place at the table with the ledgers when she heard the commotion in the yard, voices raised in the particular way that meant something was wrong rather than just loud, and she came to the door to find the whole bunkhouse assembled in the yard and Stephen and Dale talking fast and low over something Dale was holding, a piece of paper. She stepped out. Stephen looked up and the expression on his face made her stomach tighten. "What happened?" she asked. "Lester Crane," Dale said, and the name meant something to the men in the yard because several of them muttered darkly. To Effie, Dale said, "Lester Crane owns the Arrowhead spread 15 miles south. He's been trying to buy us out for 2 years. Harold wouldn't sell." "And now Harold is gone," Stephen said. He held the paper out to Effie. "This is a notice of a debt claim. Crane says Harold owed him money on a grazing rights arrangement from 4 years ago, and that the debt has not been serviced since. He's filed with the county and he's claiming rights to 20% of the herd as payment." Effie took the paper and read it. She read it again. "What's the arrangement he's describing?" she asked. "Exactly what he says," Dale said heavily. "Harold let Crane run 50 head on the north pasture for 2 seasons. Harold said Crane paid him for it at the time. Is there a record of that payment?" "That's the question," Stephen said. "We can't find it." Effie went back inside without another word. She heard Stephen follow her, and then the door, and then the sound of him waiting while she went to the shelf where she had organized Harold's papers into their proper categories, and pulled down the box she had labeled Northern Grazing Agreements, 1877-1880. She went through it slowly and methodically while Stephen stood at her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, which she noted and set aside. The payment record was there. It was on one of Harold's napkin scraps, which was where several of his most important records lived, but the date and the amount and Lester Crane's initials were all present and clear. Harold Rutledge had recorded 2 payments from Crane totaling the full amount of the 2-season arrangement, dated 1878 and 1879. Effie set it on the table. Stephen looked at it for a long moment and then let out a breath that he seemed to have been holding since he read Crane's letter. "That's it," he said. "It is," Effie said. "You'll want to take this to the county seat at Sumner before you leave, a copy at minimum with the original secured." "You'll have to take it," Stephen said. "I can't delay the drive." "Then I'll take it," Effie said. He turned to look at her directly and they were close, the table between them but not much else, and his expression was something she thought she understood but was not ready to name. "You do that." "It's my job," Effie said. "It's more than what I asked you to do when I offered you work. You offered me a percentage of what the ranch clears. I have an interest in making sure Lester Crane doesn't take 20% of your herd before it ever reaches Abilene." He looked at her for another moment. "Thank you, Effie." It was the first time he had used her given name and he seemed to realize it as it came out, a slight pause following it, but he didn't take it back. She did not tell him it was fine or try to smooth the moment over. She just said, "You're welcome, Stephen," and turned back to the papers. The drive left before dawn the next morning. 1,000 head of bawling, reluctant longhorns moving north under the stars, with 9 cowboys riding and Dale Pickett as trail boss in Stephen's absence. Because Stephen's place was on the drive itself, at the front and flank, and whatever position needed him, which was most of them. Effie stood on the porch in the gray pre-dawn and watched the shapes of cattle and horses dissolve into the darkness ahead of them, and thought that it was one of the stranger things she had ever seen. All that animal life moving away into the immense dark plain, and somehow brave. Stephen came by last, his horse tossing its head against the bit, and he pulled up at the edge of the yard. "The Crane document is in the envelope on the table," Effie said. "Original and the copy I made." "I know you'll handle it," Stephen said. His voice was low in the quiet of the pre-dawn, almost intimate in its practicality. "And everything else." "I will." He looked at her a moment longer than necessary, his dark horse restless under him. "I'll be back by the end of July if the drive goes well. I'll have your accounts waiting," Effie said. He touched the brim of his hat and rode after the herd, and Effie stood on the porch until she couldn't hear the cattle anymore, until there was nothing but the wind and the Kansas dark and the distant calling of something wild from the direction of the creek. She went inside and went to work. The weeks that followed were both busy and, in an unexpected way, peaceful. The ranch without its full crew had a different quality, quieter and more open, and Effie found that she worked best in that quiet. She handled the Crane matter efficiently, taking the original payment record to the county seat at Wellington in the company of a neighboring rancher named Abbott who had business in town, and whose wife had taken a kind interest in Effie since her arrival. A woman named Clara Abbott who was practical and warm in equal measure, and who had the ability to communicate entire paragraphs of opinion through the angle of her eyebrows. The county clerk looked at Harold's payment record, and at Crane's claim, and at Effie, who sat across from him with the rocking R ledger open to the corresponding entries she had cross-referenced, and told her the claim would be dismissed. Lester Crane, when the news reached him, sent an intermediary to the ranch to offer Effie what he called a courtesy payment for her trouble, which she correctly understood as an attempt to involve her in his business, and declined with impeccable politeness. Clara Abbott, hearing about this over tea at the Abbott Ranch 2 days later, said, "That man is as crooked as a dog's hind leg." And Effie, who had been in Kansas long enough to start finding that kind of expression natural, laughed until she had to set down her cup. She also, in the months the drive was gone, came to understand the ranch in a way that ledgers alone couldn't give her. She rode out with the 2 hands Stephen had left behind, a quiet older man named Gus who handled the horses, and a young fellow named Wheeze who did odd jobs and was apparently incapable of passing a fence post without checking whether it needed mending, and she learned the land. The south pasture with its good grass and the north with its stubborn clay soil. The creek line where the willows grew and where the cattle liked to shelter when the summer heat built up. The way the sky changed in the afternoon when a storm was coming, how the color of the light went greenish and still. She learned to ride properly, not the careful posting trot she had arrived with but the flat western seat that the country required, and she fell off twice and got back on both times, and Gus watched this without comment, which she came to understand was his version of approval. She was still a city woman. She knew that. She knew it every morning when she looked at herself in the small mirror in her room and saw someone who had not been born to this, someone who had chosen it deliberately and was choosing it again every day. She found that she did not mind that. There was something clarifying about being in a place that was honest about what it demanded. The summer built and turned, and the heat was a physical thing on the flat land, and Effie wrote letters to her mother in St. Louis that were honest without being alarming, describing Kansas and the work and the sky in terms that conveyed something true about why she had stayed. Her mother wrote back with letters full of St. Louis news and a persistent undercurrent of hope that Effie would come home soon. And Effie read these letters carefully and with love and folded them away and did not come home. She wrote to her brother James once, a longer letter that was more honest than the ones to her mother, and she described the rocking R and the drive and the ledgers and the view from the porch at evening and the sound the prairie made in the dark. She did not describe Stephen Garrett at any length, but she used his name several times more than was strictly necessary for the business content of the letter. And James, who was observant, wrote back with a single paragraph about how he had always thought she needed somewhere that gave her room to be large, followed by a pointed and brotherly inquiry about who Stephen Garrett was. She did not answer that particular question. The drive came back the first week of August, earlier than expected because the trail had been good and the water stops well managed, and because the price at Abilene had been better than the last 2 years, and because Dale Pickett had driven them hard and well. Effie heard them coming before she could see them, the changed quality of the air, some pressure and sound combination that preceded a large body of moving animals, and she was on the porch when the first shape of the Point riders appeared against the shimmer of the afternoon horizon. She went inside and changed her dress. She was not sure why she did this, and she did not examine it closely. She was on the porch again when Stephen rode into the yard, thin from 2.5 months on the trail, brown darker by the summer sun, his horse moving with the particular loose-limbed exhaustion of an animal that had been worked properly. He saw her and pulled up, and for a moment there was just the sound of the rest of the drive coming in behind him, the calling back and forth of tired men, the horses, the lowing of the cattle as they were pushed toward the north pasture. "How'd we do?" he asked, which was such a purely practical first sentence after 2.5 months that she found it made her feel extraordinarily fond of him. "Lester Crane's claim was dismissed," she said. "Your accounts are current and reconciled. Your margin on this drive, accounting for all expenses and the 3 debts your uncle owed, will be approximately $420 clear, depending on the final price." He sat on his horse and looked at her. $420. Give or take. The actual Abilene price will determine the exact figure. He dismounted slowly, in the way of a man whose body had more opinions than usual, and handed his horse to Weeze, who had appeared, and he stood in the yard and looked at her from a distance of maybe 10 feet, and something in his expression had changed from when he had ridden out in May, or maybe it had not changed so much as become visible in a way that it hadn't been before. $420 clear, he said again, quietly, like he was testing the shape of the number. Uncle Harold never cleared more than $250, and that was a good year. Your uncle was not tracking his losses carefully, Effie said, or his supplier negotiations. I renegotiated the feed contract with Morrison at the mill while you were gone. You'll save 11% on feed costs going forward. Stephen walked toward her slowly, and she stood her ground, which she always did, and he stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "I have 2 things to say to you." "All right." "The first is that I am going to pay your full salary, not a percentage, because what you did for this ranch while we were gone is worth more than any percentage of any drive." He said this plainly, like stating a fact about the weather. "That's generous," Effie said carefully. "It's not generous, it's just right." He was still looking at her, and the afternoon light was behind him, and the yard was starting to fill with tired cowboys and horses and the general chaos of a drive returning, and none of it seemed to matter particularly. "The second thing is that I would like to ask you to supper this evening, not as your employer, as a man asking a woman to supper." The yard around them was suddenly, clearly, not as inattentive as it looked. Effie was aware of Cutter Briggs stopping 20 feet away, with an expression she couldn't quite see, and of Pete Dawes dropping something, and of Rodrigo Vila looking at the sky with elaborate unconcern. "That would be agreeable," Effie said. Something in Stephen's face relaxed. A thing she hadn't quite realized was tense until it wasn't. He nodded. 7 o'clock, he said, and turned to deal with his returning herd, and the yard resumed its noise, and Effie went inside to make the final entries for the summer accounts with a clarity of mind that she had to work rather hard to maintain. Horace made something remarkable for supper that night. A roasted chicken with the biscuits he was famous for, and a dish of stewed tomatoes from Clara Abbott's garden that she had sent over in a gesture of neighborly timing so impeccable that Effie suspected Clara knew more about the state of things at the Rocking R than she had let on. Effie and Stephen ate at the big table in the ranch house dining room with real napkins, which was not the usual arrangement, and the conversation moved easily from the practical to something more personal in the way that conversations do when two people have been circling something for months and are finally standing still. Stephen told her about the drive, the good parts and the difficult ones, the night south of the Cimarron when a thunderstorm had come up fast and the herd had nearly scattered, and the cowboys had ridden hard in the rain for 4 hours to hold them. He described the landscape changing as they moved north, the grass character and the quality of the light. He talked about Abilene with the particular ambivalence of a man who finds a city useful and a little overwhelming in equal measure. Effie told him about the summer at the ranch, about her lessons with Gus, and the fence mending with Wheeze, and the afternoon she had tried to help with a difficult berth on the south pasture, and how Gus had very diplomatically suggested she might be more helpful holding the lantern than actively intervening, which had been correct. She told him about her letters from James and her mother. She told him about the evening she had ridden out to the creek line alone and watched the sun go down over the flat land and felt, for the first time in her adult life, entirely in the right place. Stephen listened to this last thing with particular attention. "The first time," he said. "The first time," she confirmed. "St. Louis never gave you that." "St. Louis was fine," she said fairly. "It just wasn't quite large enough for me." He smiled at that, the full warm smile she had already catalogued as one of her favorite things about his face. "Kansas is large." "It is," she agreed. "That helps." After supper they sat on the porch while the ranch settled down around them, the sounds of men and horses quieting to the low murmur of the bunkhouse, and then to the prairie's own sounds, the insects and the wind. The sky was what it always was in Kansas, astonishing, full of stars from one edge of the world to the other with no city light to dilute them. "I want to ask you something," Stephen said. He was sitting beside her on the porch steps, close enough that their arms were almost touching and his elbows were on his knees and he was looking at the dark yard. "And I want to ask it plainly because I've been told that I'm sometimes too direct." "I haven't found that to be a problem," Effie said. He turned to look at her. "I want you to stay." "I'm employed here," she said carefully. "That's not what I mean," he said. "And you know it." She did know it. She had known it for some time, sitting with the knowledge the way you sit with something you're not quite ready to say aloud. "I know," she said. "I don't know how to do this well," he said, in that direct way that was, she had found, one of the things she most respected about him. "I've been out here working this land since I was 19 and I haven't had much practice with." He stopped. "Asking women to stay," Effie offered. "Asking anyone to stay," he said. "Wanting anyone to." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't want anyone to before." The night air moved over them, warm and dark and full of grass smell, and Effie thought about St. Louis and about $47.30, and about Harold Ruttage's napkin paper bookkeeping, and about the drive going north in the dark, and about the creek at sunset, and about all the ways a life could be shaped differently than you expected it to be shaped. "I'll stay," she said. He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. They were sitting close on the porch steps with the stars of Kansas overhead and the sounds of a ranch settling around them. And when he kissed her, it was quiet and deliberate and honest in exactly the way she would have expected from him, which was to say it was exactly what she had wanted. What happened after that was not a simple thing, because nothing at the Rocking R was simple, and Effie would not have wanted it to be. They were two people with strong opinions and practical minds, who had found each other in a place that demanded everything they had, and the process of becoming something together was gradual and sometimes complicated and entirely real. There was the question of the bunkhouse, which had opinions, as bunkhouses do. The morning after the supper on the porch, The news was somehow general knowledge before breakfast, which in a community of 10 people was perhaps not surprising. Pete Dawes was visibly delighted, in the way of a young man who has been rooting for something and is glad to see it come right. Rodrigo Vila nodded at Effie over his coffee cup with the particular warmth of someone who has been paying quiet attention for a long time. Dale Pickett shook Stephen's hand and said something low that made Stephen nod. Cutter Briggs said nothing for 2 days, which was unusual for him, and then on the 3rd day he found Effie in the yard checking the supply inventory list and stood there a moment before saying, "You did good work on those books," in a tone that cost him something to produce. "Thank you, Cutter," Effie said, without making anything more of it. He stood there another moment, working on something. "The route change," he said. "Bluff Creek to Willow Spring. It was better." "The record said it would be," Effie said mildly. "Yeah." Another pause longer. "Well," he walked away, and that was the entirety of the rapprochement, but it was genuine, and Effie found she valued it as such. There were other complications that fall. Lester Crane did not give up his interest in the Rocking R simply because his legal claim had been dismissed, and in September he sent men to walk the fence line on the northern boundary, which was a territorial gesture as transparent as it was annoying, and Stephen rode out to meet them and told them very calmly that the next time Crane's men came onto Rocking R land, uninvited, he would send for the county sheriff, and the men went back to the Arrowhead. Crane himself came calling once in October, pulling up in a buggy with his lawyer and making another offer to buy the ranch, this time at a price that was almost reasonable, and Stephen heard him out on the porch with Effie standing at his shoulder doing nothing more threatening than holding her ledger book, and declined, and Crane looked at Effie for a moment with an expression she had no difficulty reading and left. "He thinks you're a liability to the ranch," Stephen said afterward. "I gathered," Effie said. "He's wrong." "He is," she agreed without vanity, as a simple statement of fact. The autumn was golden and enormous on the Kansas plain, the light going amber and the grass going tawny, and Effie learned more about the ranch's rhythms in those months, the work of preparing for winter, the cattle being shifted, the buildings being shored up against the cold that was coming. She rode with Stephen in the evenings when the work was done, out toward the creek or up to the ridge that was the highest point for miles in any direction, and they talked about everything that two people talk about when they are becoming each other's closest confidant, which is to say they talked about nearly everything there was. He told her about his parents, who had come to Kansas from Tennessee when Stephen was 5 and had died within a year of each other when he was 17. His father first from a fever and his mother from a grief that was also a kind of fever, and how Harold had taken him in because Harold was his mother's brother and was the kind of man who understood that some obligations were not optional. He told her about the years of learning the ranch, the mistakes and the good seasons, about what he wanted for it and what he feared. He was, she found, a man who thought carefully before he spoke but who spoke honestly when he did, and she had known enough men who spoke freely and meant little to find this combination something like a gift. She told him things she had not told anyone else, about the years of being underestimated in her father's office, of doing work that mattered and not having it seen, of the particular loneliness of being capable in a context that preferred you to be decorative. She told him about the morning she had read Harold's advertisement for a ranch records keeper in the St. Louis papers, and how she had felt, reading it, a door opening in her chest somewhere. She told him about packing her trunk and writing her resignation and her mother's expression and James's expression, which were the same expression in different faces. Were they wrong? Stephen asked, one evening with winter coming in over the ridge in a dark bank of cloud that promised snow before morning. "My mother was afraid," Effie said. "James thought I was being reckless. She considered this. James was not wrong. I was being reckless. I knew almost nothing about ranching and I had no guarantee of anything. And your mother, she was right to be afraid and wrong to think the fear was the most important thing." Stephen reached over and took her hand, which he was beginning to do more naturally, the small habitual gestures of a man who had decided something and was not uncertain about it. His hands were very warm against the chill of the evening. "What do you miss?" he asked. "From St. Louis." "My brother," she said without hesitation. "Good coffee, the public library," she thought about it. "Theater performances occasionally. James would take me when something interesting came through." She looked at him. "What do you miss from before the ranch?" He was quiet for a moment. "My mother's voice," he said. "She sang while she worked. I can't remember the songs anymore." The first snow came that night lightly, and Effie watched it from her window in the small hours, the flat land going white and still and strange in the dark, and thought about all the distances between things, St. Louis and Kansas, before and after, the person she had been and the person she was becoming, and how strange it was that distance sometimes brought you closer rather than farther away. Stephen proposed to her in December, on a clear cold day with the ground frozen hard, and the sky so blue it looked like something painted by a deliberate hand. He did it on the ridge above the creek where they often rode, and he did it without a ring because he didn't have one yet, and he said so, which was so characteristic of him that she found she was already saying yes before he had finished the sentence. "I should have the ring first," he said, with evident self-directed criticism. "The ring is a detail," Effie said. "The rest is what matters." "You're sure?" he said, and the way he said it was not insecure but honest, a man making sure the other person's choice was real. "I'm sure," she said. "I've been sure since the ledger." He looked at her. "The ledger? The night you came to check the books the first week. You looked at 3 days of work and you said thank you and you meant it, and you changed the route because the record said to without needing it to have been your idea." She looked at the frozen ridge and the blue sky. "That is a rarer quality than you seem to understand." He said nothing, but he took both her hands and held them, and the cold air moved around them and the horses stood patient at the bottom of the ridge, and Effie thought that this was, in fact, exactly the size of life she had been looking for. They were married in February of 1882, in the parlor of the Rocking R Ranch house with Clara Abbott and her husband as witnesses, and the whole bunkhouse in uncomfortable but willing attendance, and a traveling minister named Reverend Cole, who married people across 3 counties on a circuit, and arrived with his Bible and a practical handshake, and got things done with pleasing efficiency. Effie wore a dress she had made from material she'd ordered from the dry goods store in Caldwell, a dark blue wool that was practical for the Kansas February, but that she had trimmed with ivory lace because she was, still, a woman from St. Louis, and her hair was up in a manner that Clara Abbott had assisted with, and that represented the most elaborate grooming the Rocking R had probably ever witnessed. Stephen wore his good suit, which had seen less use than the suit warranted, and he stood next to her in the parlor and said his vows in the steady, direct way he did everything, looking at her with the full weight of his attention, and when Reverend Cole said they were married, he kissed her with appropriate restraint given the audience and considerably less restraint when the audience dispersed for supper. Cutter Briggs shook both their hands at the supper table and said, "Well, you'll not find a better record keeper in 4 counties," which was, given everything, probably the most romantic thing he was capable of saying, and which Effie received with genuine warmth. Pete Dawes cried a little at the ceremony, which he denied energetically. Rodrigo Vila said quietly to Effie, while the others were eating, Harold would have been glad, and Effie, who had never known Harold Rutledge but felt she had come to understand him through his records and his legacy, said, "I think so too," and meant it. The first year of their marriage was a full one in every sense. The Rocking R had a good winter and a strong early spring, and the calving season that came in late March was better than the previous year by a solid margin, which Effie recorded with satisfaction and presented to Stephen with the same no-nonsense factual clarity that had characterized their relationship since the first week. They worked together every day in the way of ranch people, which is to say they were sometimes in the same room and sometimes 5 miles apart, and the intimacy of it was woven into the practical rather than set aside from it, and they found this suited them both. She wrote to her mother and her brother in St. Louis with the news of the marriage, and her mother wrote back a letter of 3 full pages that was simultaneously worried, resigned, and clearly proud. And James wrote 1 paragraph that said he was coming to visit in June, and that he had always known she needed somewhere big enough for her, and he was glad she had found it. And the second paragraph had a question about Stephen that was 7 questions disguised as 1, which Effie answered thoroughly. James came in June, as promised, arriving in Caldwell by train with the careful alertness of a city man encountering the West for the first time, and the particular expression of an older brother, conducting a private assessment of his sister's choices. He was 31, a lawyer in St. Louis, methodical and warm and possessed of the same gray eyes as Effie that saw things accurately and didn't pretend otherwise. He and Stephen spent the first day circling each other with polite care, and the second day talking about law and land rights over the supper table until nearly midnight, and the third day James went out with Stephen to look at the herd and came back sunburned and impressed and no longer circling. "He's a good man," James told Effie privately, the evening before he went back to St. Louis, sitting on the porch with the summer dark around them. "I know," Effie said. "He thinks the world of you." "I know that too." James was quiet for a moment. "You look different than you did in St. Louis. Better or worse?" "Larger," James said. Which was what he had written in his letter, and which Effie understood was the best thing he knew how to say. She hugged her brother goodbye at the Caldwell station and watched the train take him east and felt, for a moment, the distance that was always there between herself and that previous life, and then turned and walked back to the buggy, where Stephen was waiting with the easy patience of a man who understood that goodbyes were real and took time, and climbed up beside him, and they drove back to the ranch through the Kansas evening. Their son was born in January of 1883, in the middle of a snowstorm that made the world outside the ranch house absolutely white and silent and absolute, with Clara Abbott attending as the midwife she had not mentioned she had long practice as. He was a substantial boy with dark hair that was already showing signs of his father's inclination to curl and gray eyes that were very clearly his mother's, and he arrived into the world with the confident noise of someone who had opinions about the arrangements. Stephen held him with the particular careful intensity of a large man holding something fragile and important, and his face was doing several things at once, all of them wordless. "He looks like you," Effie said, exhausted and satisfied and watching Stephen's face. "He has your eyes," Stephen said. "He'll use them to read ledgers," Effie said. Stephen laughed, which startled the baby, who expressed his opinion, and Stephen held him against his shoulder and said something low and quiet that Effie could not quite hear, but that settled the baby with impressive speed. They named him Harold James Garrett, for the uncle who had started everything and the brother who had understood it. And Harold James turned out to have a character that was something like the combination of his parents, deliberate and observant and not particularly interested in being underestimated, which was a quality that would serve him well in whatever version of the world he grew up into. The ranch grew with the years in the way that things grow when they're well tended and honestly managed. Stephen's decisions about the herd and the land were good ones, made better by the fact that he had full and accurate information about his finances for the first time in the Rocking R's history, and Effie's management of the accounts created a foundation that meant the dry years were manageable, and the good years built something lasting. Cutter Briggs stayed on at the ranch for another 8 years, becoming over time a figure of institutional memory and gruff affection, and eventually, he married a widow woman from Caldwell named Hazel, who was almost as direct as he was, and who very quickly established herself as someone who took no nonsense from anyone including Cutter, which improved him meaningfully. He came to Effie the morning after his wedding with his hat in his hands and said, "I want to say that I was wrong about you when you first came, and I knew it before the drive was back, and I should have said so sooner." And Effie told him it didn't need saying, and he told her it did, and they shook hands, which was the full shape of it and entirely sufficient. Pete Dawes saved enough from his years at the Rocking R to buy a small place of his own 20 miles south, which he ran with the same eager competence he had brought to everything. And Rodrigo Vila went south toward Texas eventually, following family, and sent a letter back once a year at Christmas that was brief and warm, and included the kind of news that accumulated into a life well lived. Dale Pickett retired in 1885, having pushed probably more cattle up the Kisham Trail than he could count, and spent his remaining years in Caldwell with a garden and strong opinions about the decline of trail driving standards, which opinions he shared with whoever happened to be nearby. Effie's mother made the trip from St. Louis in the summer of 1883 to meet Harold James, which was a significant undertaking for a woman who had not previously traveled farther west than Indiana, and she arrived in Caldwell with a trunk of gifts and a face that was visibly recalibrating at every new thing it encountered. She spent 2 weeks at the Rocking R and left with a letter in her bag that Effie had written in advance and given her on the last morning, a letter that said what Effie wanted her mother to know about why she was here and what this life was and how happy it had made her, because she had found those things easier to say in writing than in speaking, and she wanted them said properly. Her mother wrote back from St. Louis 3 weeks later and said, among other things, that the sky in Kansas was something she would not forget, and that Stephen had good manners, and that the baby had her late husband's jaw, and that she was glad Effie had found her big life, and that she would come back next year if the train schedule allowed, and she did. The second child came in 1885, a girl with her father's dark hair and a persistence of purpose that she demonstrated from the first week of her life in ways that made Horace, who was still cooking and would apparently cook until he was carried out of his kitchen, say she was going to be someone with a strong character, which was his highest compliment. They named her Alina for the character of it, and Alina grew up on the ranch with the particular combination of freedom and rootedness that the land gave to children who were raised on it honestly, knowing what work was and what the sky looked like at every hour and what it cost to build something and what it felt like when the building was solid. Harold James, her older brother by 2 years, showed from an early age that he was going to be a bookkeeper. He would sit at his mother's knee watching her work the ledgers with an attention that was too focused for coincidence and too early to be anything but instinct. And by the time he was 5, he was asking questions about the numbers that were not simple questions. "You got that from me," Effie told him, one evening when he was 6 and had correctly identified that the sum in the supply column was inconsistent with the entries below it, which it was, because Effie had made a copying error and not yet caught it. "What's wrong with it?" Harold James asked. "I made an error," Effie said. "Find it." He found it in 3 minutes, which was faster than she had expected, and she corrected it and told him he had done well, and the look on his face was a thing she kept alongside the other things she kept privately, the particular treasures of a life. In the spring of 1886, when the cattle drives were already beginning to change, as the railroads pushed further into the cattle country, and the old shape of the Kisham Trail drives was giving way to something different, and Stephen was thinking carefully about how the Rocking R needed to evolve with those changes. Effie found herself on the porch one morning with her coffee watching the sun come up over the flat land, and thinking about the morning she had ridden into Caldwell 5 years ago with her skirts pressed and her boots clean and $47.30. Stephen came out and stood beside her, a cup of his own in hand, and they stood there in the growing light without saying anything for a good while, which was one of the things she loved about him and about them together, the ease of shared silence. "Thinking about something?" he asked eventually. "Thinking about the first morning," she said. "Your boots were very clean," he said. She turned to look at him. "You noticed that?" "I notice everything about you," he said simply. "I did from the first minute." The morning light was doing the thing it did in spring on the Kansas plain, going gold and enormous, pushing the shadows back across the grass. And Harold James was inside asking Horace something about breakfast, and Alina was still asleep in her crib, and the ranch was waking up around them in its daily way. The horses in the corral and the cattle in the pasture, and the whole living machinery of the place that they had built together from Harold Ruttage's napkin paper ledgers and a woman's $47.30, and a man's willingness to listen to information even when it didn't come from where he expected it. "Cutter came by yesterday," Stephen said. "I know. He said hello from the doorway while I was feeding Alina. I think he's warming up to her. He called her a determined young woman," Stephen said. "Coming from Cutter, that's essentially a love declaration." Effie laughed. The sound of it carried out across the yard, and the horses in the corral lifted their heads briefly and then went back to their mourning. Stephen put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the easy weight of someone who has found where they belong and stopped being surprised by it. "This year is going to be a good one," she said. "You can tell from the ledgers?" he asked. "I can tell from the pasture," she said. "The grass came up well. And the calving numbers are strong." She paused. "The ledgers confirm it." He pressed a kiss to her temple, unhurried and warm. "Harold would have liked you," he said. "He'd have said you were the best thing that ever came out of the mail, and he'd have been embarrassed that he didn't think to put a proper record-keeping system in place himself so that you'd have had an easier time of it when you arrived." "The system he had was perfectly coherent," Effie said, "once you understood his logic, which took you 3 days. 2.5, she said. He was quiet for a moment, still holding her, the morning light continuing its work on the land around them. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. Are you happy here, truly?" She considered the question with the same seriousness she gave to any question worth asking, turning it over and looking at it honestly. She thought about St. Louis and the library and the theater and her brother's practical love and her mother's worried one. She thought about the Kishom Trail and the Bunkhouse and Cutter Briggs's reluctant recalibrations and Dale Pickett's handshake and Harold James's face over the ledger, and Alina's specific and powerful personality already making itself known in every room of the ranch house. She thought about this porch and this man and this sky. "I've been happy since before the first drive came back," she said. "I just didn't say so because I wasn't sure yet what it meant. And now I know exactly what it means," she said. "It means this is exactly the right size." The sun was full up over the Kansas plain, burning off the last of the morning damp, and the day was beginning in earnest with all its demands and gifts, and the rocking R was alive around them in every direction. And Effie Holloway Garrett stood on her porch with her husband's arm around her and her children inside and her ledgers on the table and the wide, enormous sky overhead, and was, without reservation or qualification or any part of her held back in doubt, entirely home. There was one more thing that happened that spring of 1886, which was that word got around Caldwell about the drive 3 years earlier, and the woman who had managed to cut the ranch's losses and organize a financial defense against Lester Crane, and then turned around and made the Rocking R the most efficiently run spread in Sumner County. And a young woman came to the door in April asking if Effie would teach her bookkeeping. Her name was Ruth Mallory, and she was 18 and from a farm family east of town. And she sat in Effie's kitchen with her hands in her lap and said she was good with numbers but didn't know how to make them do what she needed them to do. And she wanted to learn how to keep proper accounts so she could help her family's farm be better managed. Effie looked at her across the kitchen table and thought about a letter in a St. Louis newspaper and an open door and $47.30 and said, "All right, come back Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock and we'll start with the basics." Stephen, who had been at the door of the kitchen doing something that was absolutely listening, came in afterward and said, "You're going to teach her." "I'm going to teach her," Effie confirmed. "Good," he said. Ruth Mallory came on Tuesday and learned quickly, in the direct way of someone who has been waiting for the information they needed. and she went home on Tuesday evening with a proper understanding of double-entry ledger keeping and a set of Effie's notes. And she came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. And within 6 months, she was managing her family's farm accounts with a competence that impressed everyone who encountered them. And she was the first, but not the last woman who sat at that kitchen table in those years. There was a quality of life at the Rocking R in those years that was hard to describe from the outside, but that everyone who was part of it could feel. A combination of purpose and warmth and honesty that came from two people building something together without pretense, each contributing what they were best at and respecting what the other brought. The ranch was profitable and the land was well kept, and the children grew up knowing what work looked and felt like. And the bunkhouse turned over with time as men came and went. But the character of the place stayed consistent because the people at the center of it were consistent. Lester Crane sold the Arrowhead in 1887 and moved to Wichita, which ended the only persistent source of external friction the Rocking R had dealt with. And when Stephen heard the news, he came and told Effie without particular celebration, because neither of them was given to celebrating the failures of others. But there was a settled quality to the evening that followed that had to do with one more thing being resolved cleanly. The cattle drives up the Kisham Trail did change in those years, as the railroad pushed further into Texas, and the economics of driving cattle hundreds of miles on foot shifted toward loading them onto train cars, and Stephen adapted the ranch's operation accordingly, breeding different stock for the local and regional market, investing in improvements that paid out over years rather than single drives. He talked through every major decision with Effie over the kitchen table in the evenings with the ledgers open between them, and she told him what the numbers said, and he told her what the land said, and between them they got it right more often than not. Harold James, at 12, was helping his mother with the accounts in a real and useful way, cross-checking entries and catching errors and beginning to understand the relationship between the numbers on the page and the cattle in the pasture, and the hay in the store and the money in the bank, which was the full loop of it, the thing that made accounting mean something rather than just being figures for their own sake. Effie watched him understand this and felt a satisfaction that was private and deep. Eleanor, at 10, had no particular interest in numbers but had a considerable interest in horses, in the systematic way of someone who wants to understand a thing completely and from first principles, and she had already extracted more information from Gus, who was still with the ranch and seemed to be in the process of becoming genuinely ageless, than Gus had probably shared with anyone else in the previous decade combined. "She reminds me of someone," Stephen said, watching Eleanor talking to Gus in the corral one September evening. "She reminds everyone of someone," Effie said. "She has your determination and my tendency to get information before doing things." "A dangerous combination," Stephen said. "A very effective one," Effie said. He put his arm around her again, standing at the corral fence in the autumn evening with the good smell of horses and hay and the last warm days of the Kansas year around them, and she leaned into him, and it was simple and full and true. In 1889, when Harold James was 6 years into his interest in accounting and Eleanor was developing a serious reputation as the best young horseperson in Sumner County, and the Rocking R was in the strongest financial position of its history, Effie received a letter from James in St. Louis that contained, among other news, the information that he was getting married to a woman named Margaret who was apparently both brilliant and formidable, which was James's highest praise, and that he wanted Effie and Stephen and the children to come to St. Louis for the wedding. They went, which was the first time Effie had been back to St. Louis since she left, and the city was both familiar and strange in the way of places you have grown away from, the same streets and buildings but seen through different eyes. Her mother was older and warm and made much of Harold James and Eleanor and looked at Stephen with the accumulated approval of 7 years and said privately to Effie, "I worried so much when you left," and Effie said, "I know," and her mother said, "I was wrong to let the worry be the loudest thing," and Effie said, "You weren't wrong, you were a mother, which is something different." James's Margaret was indeed both brilliant and formidable. A woman who ran a private school in St. Louis with the authority of someone who understood education was not a luxury but a foundation. And she and Effie liked each other immediately, in the particular way of women who recognize a shared quality in each other, the quality of taking up the space that is yours without apology and without aggression, simply as a matter of fact. They spent a week in St. Louis, and the city was good and interesting and full of things that Effie had missed and was glad to revisit. And on the last evening before the train back to Kansas, Effie stood at the window of her mother's house looking at the St. Louis street, the gas lights and the carriages and the particular density of city life, and Stephen came and stood beside her. Regretting anything? He asked, which was his version of the same question he had asked on the porch in 1886, the real question that lived underneath all the practical ones. "Not a single thing," Effie said. "Not then, not now, not ever." "Good," he said. "Because I would like to get back to the ranch before the weather changes." "The ledgers need updating," she agreed, and the smile she gave him was private and complete and full of everything the last 8 years had made of them. They went home on the train with Harold James and Alina, who spent most of the journey in different states of alertness. Harold James reading and Alina watching the landscape with an attention that was clearly cataloging it for purposes of her own. And the Kansas plain came back into view through the train window in the golden late light of an autumn afternoon, and Effie felt the particular sensation, clean and full and unmistakable, of returning to herself. The rocking R was waiting for them, the ranch house and the bunkhouse and the corral and the pastures and the creek line and the sky that was never anything but enormous. And Gus was at the station to meet them with the buggy, and the horses knew the way home and took them there without being asked, and the evening was cool and clear and smelled like grass and coming winter. Harold James ran ahead to find Horace, who at this point in his life was more legend than cook, but who maintained that he was still the best biscuit maker in Sumner County, which nobody disputed because nobody wanted to and because it was also true. Alina went straight to the corral to check on her mare, a steel-gray horse she had named Calculus for reasons she had explained to Gus at length, and that Gus had accepted with his characteristic philosophical equanimity. Effie and Stephen stood in the yard in the last of the evening light, the way they had stood on the porch in those early evenings when everything was still finding its shape, and looked at what they had built. "You know what Cutter told me before he retired last year," Stephen said. "What did he tell you?" "He said that the whole bunkhouse had said you were too city for the drive." He paused, "and that you brought the herd in before any of them." Effie looked at him. "I didn't go on the drive." "He didn't mean the cattle drive," Stephen said. "He meant all of it, the ranch." He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, the way he always had from that first evening with the lamp and the ledger and the question of whether she would stay. "He said you drove the whole thing home, the whole operation. He said Harold would have known it right away." Effie was quiet for a moment, looking at the ranch house and the bunkhouse and the corral and the children somewhere inside and the sky going dark over the plain. "Cutter Briggs said that," she said. "He did, in those words." She turned and looked at Stephen, the man who had been straight with her from the first sentence, and had changed a route because records said he should and had asked her to stay with the same directness he brought to every true thing, and said, "Well, he came around eventually." Stephen laughed, and the sound of it went out into the Kansas evening, and she laughed too, and somewhere inside the ranch house Harold James called to Alina about something and Alina called back, and Horace's voice said something about biscuits, and the horses in the corral moved in the dusk, and the stars were coming out over the plain, one and then another, and then the whole impossible abundance of them. And Effie Holloway Garrett stood in the yard of the rocking R in the autumn of 1889 and felt. with the full certainty of someone who has traveled far enough to know the difference, that she was exactly and completely and permanently home,